The richest man who ever lived died with less than $2 million to his name. John D. Rockefeller once controlled 90% of America's oil, owned 1.5% of the entire United States economy, and built a fortune worth over $400 billion in today's money. Then he gave almost all of it away. This is the story of how a bookkeeper's son from Cleveland became the world's first billionaire, crushed every competitor who stood in his way, and then spent the last 40 years of his life trying to repair his reputation. July 8th, 1839. A farmhouse in Richford, New York. Barely more than a shack. William Avery Rockefeller paced outside, while his wife Eliza screamed through another contraction. Inside, the midwife worked by candlelight. The baby arrived healthy, a boy they named John Davison Rockefeller. He would not stay in that farmhouse long. William Rockefeller was a problem. He called himself a doctor, though he had no training. He sold bottles of medicine that were mostly alcohol and herbs, travelling from town to town with his wagon and his pitch. Cancer specialist, he'd tell people, even though cancer couldn't be cured then or now, by whatever he was selling. He was gone for months at a time. When he came back, he brought money, but also trouble. Rumours followed him everywhere. Some said he had another family in Canada. Others whispered darker things. Eliza held the household together through sheer force of will. She was devout Baptist, the kind of Christian who read scripture every morning and believed that God was watching every action, judging every choice. While William disappeared for weeks, Eliza managed the farm, raised the children, and taught them that work was sacred. Young John absorbed this completely. He would later say that his mother was the greatest influence on his life. The family moved constantly, Richford to Moravia to Owago, always one step ahead of something, usually William's debts or his scandals. By 1853, they'd landed in Strongsville, Ohio, a small town outside Cleveland. John was 14 years old and already different from other boys his age. While they played, he worked. While they spent their pennies on candy, he saved every cent. He kept a small ledger even then, recording every transaction. 3 cents for candy, 5 cents earned doing chores. The numbers had to balance. This wasn't play for him. This was how the world worked, and he was learning the rules. His first job outside the family came at 16, a bookkeeper position at Hewitt & Tuttle, a produce shipping company in Cleveland. The interview was brief. The partners asked if he could do the work. John said yes. They offered him 50 cents a day. He took it without negotiation, then went home and recorded the arrangements in his ledger with perfect precision. For 3.5 years, John Rockefeller sat at that desk and learned how business actually worked, not the theory, the practice, how merchants moved goods, how they negotiated prices, how they extended credit and collected debts, how some companies thrived while others failed. He watched everything, recorded everything, understood everything. The work suited him perfectly. Numbers never lied, they never cheated. They never disappeared for months like his father. They simply were. Assets and liabilities, credits and debits. The ledger always balanced if you did it right. He noticed something during those years. The produce business was seasonal and unpredictable. A harsh winter meant no crops. A mild winter meant too many crops and falling prices. The merchants who survived were the ones who could withstand the swings, who had capital reserves, who didn't panic when times got hard. The desperate ones went under every year. March 1859. John turned 20 years old and made a decision that would change everything. He quit Hewitt & Tuttle, not out of anger or frustration, but because he'd learned what they could teach him. Now it was time to build something of his own. He needed a partner, someone with complementary skills and, more importantly, some capital. He found Maurice Clark, an English immigrant who'd saved $2,000. John had saved $800 plus another $1,000 he borrowed from his father at 10% interest. William might have been an absent father, but he understood business. That loan would be repaid with interest, no exceptions. Clark and Rockefeller opened their doors, as commission merchants. They didn't own the goods they sold. They connected buyers and sellers, taking a percentage of each transaction. Grain, meat, farm equipment, whatever people needed to buy or sell. The margins were thin, but the volume could be enormous if you worked hard enough. And John Rockefeller worked harder than anyone. He was at the office before dawn. He stayed past dark. He traveled to farms and factories, building relationships, learning what people needed before they knew they needed it. The ledger grew thicker. The accounts multiplied. By the end of the first year, they'd done $450,000 in business. But something else was happening in Pennsylvania that would make the produce business look quaint. In August 1859, a man named Edwin Drake struck oil near Titusville. Not just a little oil, a gusher. Suddenly everyone wanted in on the oil business. Prospectors rushed to Pennsylvania like it was the California gold rush. Towns appeared overnight. Fortunes were made and lost in weeks. John watched this chaos with cold calculation. Oil was valuable, that much was obvious. Kerosene for lamps was replacing whale oil, and the demand was exploding. But drilling for oil was gambling. Some wells struck rich, most came up dry. The drillers were wildcatters, speculators, men who got rich quick or went broke trying. That wasn't how John Rockefeller operated. He saw something different. Everyone was focused on getting oil out of the ground. But someone had to refine that crude oil into usable kerosene. Someone had to transport it. Someone had to sell it. The infrastructure, not the speculation, that's where the real opportunity was. In 1863, he made his move. Clark had a brother who wanted to build an oil refinery. Did John want in? He did, but only on his terms. He'd invest, but he'd also control the books. He'd manage the finances. The others could run the operations, but the numbers ran through him. The refinery started small. Cleveland had advantages that the boom towns in Pennsylvania didn't. It was connected by railroad to both the East Coast and the growing markets in the West. It had access to capital that frontier towns lacked. And it had John Rockefeller, who brought the same meticulous attention to refining oil that he'd brought to shipping grain. He studied every aspect of the process. How much crude oil went in, how much kerosene came out, how much waste was produced, what that waste could be used for. Every barrel, every gallon, every drop had to be accounted for and optimized. While other refiners accepted 10 to 15% waste as normal, John pushed his people to cut it to 5%, then 3%. The attention to detail bordered on obsessive. He once spent an entire afternoon watching a machine seal oil barrels. It used 40 drops of solder per barrel. John wondered if 38 drops would work just as well. They tested it. It did. That tiny change, multiplied across thousands of barrels, saved thousands of dollars. But the partnership with the Clarks wasn't working. Morris wanted to focus on the commission business, which was safe and steady. His brother wanted to expand the refinery aggressively. John was caught in the middle, and he hated being caught in the middle. The ledger couldn't balance when the partners wanted different things. February 1865, the partnership dissolved. They held an auction to determine who would buy out whom. The bidding started at $500. It climbed to $1,000, then $5,000. Maurice Clark kept raising, expecting John to back down. John didn't back down. He never backed down when he believed he was right. The price hit $72,000. Maurice stopped. John won. He walked out of that auction owning the refinery completely, though he'd gone deeply into debt to do it. He was 25 years old and had just bet everything on oil. But it wasn't really a bet. He'd done the calculations. He knew the costs, the margins, the market. This wasn't gambling. This was certainty. The next decision came quickly. He needed a new partner, someone who understood chemistry and refining operations, while he focused on finance and strategy. He found Samuel Andrews, a chemist who'd been working at the refinery. Andrews knew how to squeeze more kerosene out of crude oil than anyone else in Cleveland. That was worth a partnership. Rockefeller and Andrews. The name went on the building in 1866. They weren't the biggest refinery in Cleveland yet, but they were the most efficient. While competitors wasted money on fancy offices and expensive equipment, John poured every dollar back into improving the process. Better stills, better storage, better transportation contracts. The railroads were key. Oil had to move from the refineries to the markets, and the railroads controlled that movement. Most refiners paid whatever shipping rates the railroads demanded. John negotiated. He promised volume, guaranteed shipments, regular schedules. In exchange, he wanted discounts. The railroads agreed because John always delivered exactly what he promised. Those shipping discounts gave him an edge. He could sell kerosene for less than his competitors and still make more profit. When other refiners cut their prices to compete, they squeezed their own margins. John's margins stayed comfortable. It was mathematical, inevitable. Cleveland had over 30 refineries by 1868. Most of them were struggling. The oil market was volatile. Prices swung wildly based on how much crude oil was coming out of Pennsylvania at any given moment. When prices dropped, refiners went bankrupt. When prices spiked, new refiners appeared and flooded the market, causing prices to drop again. It was chaos. John Rockefeller hated chaos. Chaos was inefficient. Chaos was wasteful. Chaos meant that perfectly good refineries shut down because their owners couldn't weather a temporary downturn. There had to be a better way. The solution crystallized in his mind over months of observation. The problem wasn't just volatile prices, the problem was too many refineries. Too much competition meant everyone's margins suffered. But if someone controlled most of the refining capacity, they could stabilize prices. They could operate efficiently. They could make long-term plans instead of reacting to daily swings. That someone would be him. January 10th, 1870. John D. Rockefeller, Samuel Andrews, and 3 other partners signed papers creating a new company, Standard Oil Company of Ohio. Capitalized at $1 million. John held the largest share and became president. He was 30 years old, and he was about to build the most powerful monopoly in American history. The name wasn't an accident. Standard implied reliability, consistency, quality. While other refiners produced kerosene that varied in purity and burned unpredictably, Standard Oil would set the standard. Every barrel would meet specifications. Every customer would know exactly what they were getting. That brand meant something, but the real strategy was just beginning. John looked at those 30 refineries in Cleveland and saw an opportunity. Most were barely profitable. Their owners were stressed, watching the market fluctuate, wondering if they'd survive the next downturn. John would offer them a way out. He called it the Cleveland Massacre, though John himself never used that term. He preferred consolidation. The strategy was elegant in its brutality. Between February and March 1872, John and his partners approached every refinery owner in Cleveland with an offer. Sell to Standard Oil. The price would be fair, sometimes generous. Owners could take cash or Standard Oil stock. Some could stay on as managers, but the offer wouldn't last forever. Most owners were terrified. Rumors swirled through Cleveland's business district. Standard Oil was backed by powerful railroad interests. They could get shipping rates no one else could match. They had unlimited capital. Fight them and you'd be crushed. Sell now, and at least you'd get something. 22 of Cleveland's 25 refineries sold to Standard Oil within 48 hours. 2 more followed in the next week. By the end of March, John controlled almost all of Cleveland's refining capacity. The entire operation took 6 weeks. What the sellers didn't fully understand was that John hadn't used railroad backing or unlimited capital. He'd used psychology. The threat was mostly perception. Standard Oil was stronger than competitors, certainly, but not overwhelmingly so. Not yet. But the appearance of inevitability created actual inevitability. Owners sold because they believed resistance was futile. Their surrender made it true. The few who refused learned a harsh lesson. John didn't need to destroy them directly. He simply negotiated railroad shipping rates they couldn't match, undercut their prices slightly, and waited. Within months they were begging to sell, and by then the price had dropped. One owner held out longer than the rest. His name was Frank Rockefeller, John's younger brother. Frank owned a competing refinery and refused to join Standard Oil on principle. He wanted to prove he could succeed independently. John let him try for a while, then systematically eliminated every advantage Frank had until Frank's refinery became unsustainable. When Frank finally sold, John paid him a fair price, shook his hand, and never spoke of it again. Business was business. Cleveland was just the beginning. John looked at the national landscape and saw the same problem repeated in every oil region. Pennsylvania had dozens of refineries. New York had refineries. Pittsburgh had refineries. All of them competing, all of them suffering from the same volatile market conditions. The solution remained the same: consolidation, control, standardization. But buying out every refinery in America would require more capital than Standard Oil currently had. John needed a new strategy, something more sophisticated than direct buyouts. He needed leverage. The railroads provided it. 3 major railroads moved oil from the Pennsylvania fields to the refineries and then to the markets. The Erie, the New York Central, and the Pennsylvania Railroad competed viciously for oil shipping contracts. Their competition kept rates low and unstable, which hurt their profits. John approached them with a proposal. What if the railroads formed a cooperative arrangement? Instead of competing, they'd divide the oil shipping business according to agreed percentages. They'd set standard rates and stick to them. In exchange, they'd give substantial rebates to the largest shippers, the ones who could guarantee steady volume. The largest shipper would be Standard Oil. But John went further. Standard Oil would also receive rebates on oil that competitors shipped. The railroads would charge competitors the standard rate, then quietly kick back a portion to Standard Oil. John's company would profit every time a competitor moved oil. The arrangement was called the South Improvement Company, though it had nothing to do with the South and improved nothing except Standard Oil's position. When word leaked about the scheme, the oil regions exploded in rage. Producers, small refiners, and independent operators saw it for what it was: a conspiracy to eliminate competition through railroad discrimination. They organized boycotts. They refused to sell crude oil to any refinery associated with the South Improvement Company. They held mass meetings denouncing Rockefeller as a monopolist. The Pennsylvania legislature investigated. Newspapers ran furious editorials. John sat quietly in his Cleveland office while the storm raged. He'd expected resistance. What mattered was whether the resistance could sustain itself. It couldn't. The South Improvement Company was officially dissolved under public pressure, but the damage was done. John had demonstrated what was possible. The railroads had seen how profitable cooperation could be. The framework remained even after the formal structure disappeared. John continued buying refineries, but now he was more subtle. He didn't announce purchases. He didn't consolidate operations immediately. Instead, he bought controlling interests and left the original owners' names on the buildings. To the outside world, these appeared to be independent competitors. In reality, they all answered to John. By 1873, Standard Oil controlled nearly a quarter of America's refining capacity. By 1874, it was closer to half. The remaining independent refiners found themselves competing against an opponent who could sustain losses indefinitely, who had better shipping rates, better credit, better access to crude oil supplies. One by one, they sold. The pattern repeated across the country. Philadelphia refiners sold. Pittsburgh refiners sold. New York refiners sold. Sometimes John paid in cash. Often he paid in Standard Oil stock, which was rapidly becoming more valuable than the refineries themselves. Owners who took the stock became wealthy. Owners who demanded cash often regretted it later when they saw how much that stock appreciated. John preferred paying in stock. It aligned interests. Former competitors became partners invested in Standard Oil's success. They stopped fighting and started cooperating. They shared knowledge about refining techniques, about suppliers, about markets. The whole operation became more efficient than the sum of its parts. This was John's genius. He didn't just eliminate competition, he absorbed it. He transformed enemies into allies by making them stakeholders. The monopoly grew not through destruction, but through conversion. Not everyone converted willingly. Some producers in Pennsylvania decided to bypass the refiners entirely and build their own pipeline to the coast. If they could transport crude oil directly to ships, they could sell it overseas and avoid the refinery bottleneck that Standard Oil controlled. John couldn't allow that. If producers could ship independently, his leverage disappeared. He moved quickly and quietly. Standard Oil began buying land along the proposed pipeline route. When construction started, they discovered that Standard Oil owned key parcels, and John refused to grant right-of-way. The pipeline had to detour, adding months and enormous costs. While the pipeline struggled, John built his own. He'd realized that controlling transportation mattered as much as controlling refining. Standard Oil created a subsidiary that laid pipelines from the Pennsylvania oil fields directly to the refineries. They could move crude oil cheaper and faster than anyone else. The independent pipeline project collapsed under delays and cost overruns. John bought the assets for cents on the dollar. By 1877, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of America's refining capacity. It was no longer a company, it was an empire. And John was running it with mechanical precision from his office in Cleveland, later New York. Every decision flowed through him. He reviewed reports on refinery operations, transportation costs, market prices, competitor activities. He knew how much kerosene each refinery produced daily. He knew which markets paid the highest prices. He knew when to buy crude oil and when to wait for prices to drop. His managers called it the Standard Oil Way. Everything documented, everything measured, everything optimized. There was a correct way to refine kerosene, a correct way to store it, a correct way to ship it. Deviation was waste, and waste was sin. Employees who followed the system were promoted. Employees who improvised or cut corners were replaced. John didn't care about personalities or relationships. He cared about results, and results came from following the process. Critics called it ruthless. John called it efficient. The distinction mattered to him. Ruthlessness implied cruelty for its own sake. John was never cruel. He simply refused to let sentiment interfere with logic. If a refinery was losing money, it closed. If an employee underperformed, they were let go. If a competitor was driving down prices unsustainably, they were bought out or bankrupted. These weren't personal decisions, they were mathematical ones. But mathematics was creating something unprecedented in American business. Standard Oil was larger and more powerful than any private company had ever been. It employed thousands directly and controlled tens of thousands more through subsidiary companies and partnerships. It moved millions of barrels of oil annually. Its decisions affected prices worldwide. John owned roughly a quarter of the company. His original partners owned smaller portions. By the late 1870s, John was worth several $1 million, an almost inconceivable fortune at the time. He could have retired, lived in luxury, spent his remaining years in comfort. He worked harder instead. The empire needed structure. Standard Oil was technically an Ohio corporation, but it operated across state lines through dozens of subsidiary companies. The legal framework was getting complicated. Shareholders in Pennsylvania couldn't easily hold stock in an Ohio company. Regulations varied by state. The whole arrangement was becoming unwieldy. John's lawyers proposed a solution: the trust. In 1882, Standard Oil reorganized into the Standard Oil Trust. Shareholders in all the various subsidiary companies exchanged their shares for trust certificates. The trust owned everything. 9 trustees, with John as the dominant voice, controlled the entire operation. It was brilliant. The trust operated as a single entity while maintaining the legal fiction of separate companies. It could move capital freely between subsidiaries. It could coordinate operations across the entire country. It could make decisions quickly without worrying about conflicting state regulations. It was also legally questionable, though that wouldn't become clear for years. The trust expanded beyond refining. Standard Oil bought pipelines, storage facilities, railroad tank cars. It built ships to transport kerosene overseas. It established distribution networks in every American city and towns across Europe, Asia, South America. When you bought kerosene anywhere in the world, you were probably buying Standard Oil kerosene, even if the can didn't say so. The company sold under dozens of brand names. Local distributors thought they were buying from independent suppliers. In reality, almost every path led back to New York, to the trust, to John. The profits were staggering. Standard Oil's annual earnings reached tens of millions of dollars. John's personal wealth climbed toward 100 million, then beyond. He became the richest man in America, possibly the richest man in the world. And he continued living modestly. The same house, the same routine. Breakfast at 7, office by 8, home by 6. He didn't buy yachts or mansions or throw elaborate parties. He donated to churches and causes quietly, without publicity. His suits were well made, but not flashy. His carriage was comfortable, but not ostentatious. Observers found it puzzling. Why accumulate wealth you didn't spend? John's answer was simple. The wealth wasn't the point. The system was the point. Building something that worked perfectly, that ran efficiently, that eliminated waste and chaos. That was satisfying. Money was just how you measured success. But while John measured success in ledgers and profit statements, others were measuring Standard Oil differently. They were counting the ruined competitors, the manipulated railroad rates, the towns dependent on a single employer, the market that no longer resembled anything like free competition. The empire John built with such careful logic was starting to attract attention from people who saw something dangerous in that efficiency. People who believed that some things mattered more than perfect systems and optimized profits. The backlash was coming, and John had no idea how powerful it would be. The first serious attack came from an unexpected direction, not from competitors or labor unions or populist politicians, but from journalists. In 1881, a young writer named Henry Demarest Lloyd published an article in the Atlantic Monthly. The story of a great monopoly exposed Standard Oil's methods in meticulous detail. The railroad rebates, the preferential rates, the systematic elimination of competitors. Lloyd's prose was measured, his facts checked, his conclusions damning. This wasn't sensationalist muckraking. It was careful documentation of exactly how Standard Oil had achieved its dominance. The article caused a sensation. Reprints sold by the thousands. People who had vaguely understood that Standard Oil was large suddenly grasped that it controlled virtually everything. The kerosene in their lamps, the lubricating oil in their machinery, the paraffin wax in their candles. All of it came from one source, flowed through one system, enriched one man. John's response was silence. He refused interviews. He issued no statements. When reporters approached him on the street, he walked past without acknowledgement. Standard Oil's lawyers prepared careful rebuttals to Lloyd's specific claims, but John vetoed their publication. Defending yourself just gave critics more ammunition. Better to say nothing. Let the business speak for itself. The strategy might have worked if Lloyd had been alone. He wasn't. The success of his article inspired others. Newspapers in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in New York began investigating Standard Oil's operations in their regions. What they found confirmed Lloyd's account. Everywhere the pattern repeated. Standard Oil entered a market, negotiated special rates, undercut local competitors, bought out the survivors, raised prices once competition vanished. State legislatures started paying attention. Ohio began an investigation into the trust structure in 1885. Was this legal? Could a group of trustees control companies chartered in multiple states? The question seemed technical, but the implications were enormous. If the trust structure was illegal, Standard Oil's entire organization might collapse. John testified before the Ohio legislature in 1888. It was his first public appearance addressing Standard Oil's methods, and he approached it with characteristic calculation. He was polite, he was precise, he answered every question directly while revealing as little as possible. Yes, the trust existed. Yes, it controlled subsidiary companies. No, this wasn't a monopoly because competitors could still enter the market. That they rarely survived wasn't Standard Oil's fault. The company was simply more efficient. The legislators weren't convinced, neither was the Attorney General. In 1890, Ohio filed suit to dissolve the Standard Oil Trust as an illegal monopoly. The case would drag through courts for years, but the message was clear. The system John had built so carefully was now being challenged by the legal system itself. Then Congress acted. The Sherman Antitrust Act passed in July 1890 with only one dissenting vote. The law prohibited every contract, combination, in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade. The language was broad, the penalties severe, the implications uncertain. Nobody knew exactly what constituted an illegal trust. The courts would have to decide. John read the law carefully. His lawyers analysed every clause. The conclusion was troubling. Standard Oil might be illegal, not because it had done anything explicitly forbidden, but because its very existence restrained trade. The dominance John had worked 30 years to achieve might violate federal law simply by being so complete. He didn't panic. Panic was wasteful. Instead, he adapted. If the trust structure was vulnerable, they would use a different structure. In 1892, Standard Oil reorganized again. The trust was dissolved. The various subsidiary companies were consolidated under a single holding company, Standard Oil of New Jersey. New Jersey's corporate laws were accommodating. They allowed one company to own stock in others. The holding company structure achieved the same result as the trust while technically complying with the law. Technically, the distinction mattered to lawyers. To critics, it looked like Standard Oil was evading the law's intent while following its letter, which was exactly what it was doing. The 1890s brought more problems. Economic depression hit in 1893. Demand for kerosene dropped. Prices fell. For the first time in years, Standard Oil's profits declined. Not catastrophically, but noticeably. The system that seemed invincible showed cracks. Workers struck at Standard Oil refineries in Ohio and Pennsylvania. They wanted higher wages, shorter hours, union recognition. John opposed unions on principle. They disrupted efficiency. They inserted outside parties into the relationship between employer and employee. They made rational planning impossible. The strikes were broken, sometimes with violence. Pinkerton agents were hired to protect facilities. Replacements were brought in. Production continued. The public relations damage was severe. Newspapers ran stories about strikers beaten by security guards. Ministers condemned Standard Oil from pulpits. The company that had brought cheap kerosene to millions was now portrayed as a brutal oppressor. John still refused to defend himself publicly, which made the silence seem like admission. Ida Tarbell changed everything. She was a journalist, the daughter of a Pennsylvania oilman who had been ruined by Standard Oil's tactics. In 1902, she began publishing a series in McClure's magazine. The history of the Standard Oil Company ran for 19 installments over 2 years. It was exhaustively researched, meticulously documented, and devastating. Tarbell had interviewed former Standard Oil employees. She had obtained internal documents. She had traced the company's history from John's early days in Cleveland through the trust formation to the present dominance. She showed exactly how Standard Oil had achieved its monopoly and maintained it. The railroad rebates, the industrial espionage, the predatory pricing, the systematic elimination of competitors. All of it documented with dates, names, figures. John read every installment. He made notes in the margins. He disputed some facts, acknowledged others, but he still refused public comment. Defending yourself against critics just made them seem more important. Better to ignore them, but Tarbell couldn't be ignored. Her series was republished as a book. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It became the defining account of Standard Oil's rise. Suddenly everyone knew John's methods. The careful secrecy of 30 years evaporated. The system he had built in private was now dissected in public, and the dissection wasn't flattering. Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901 after McKinley's assassination. Roosevelt believed in capitalism, but he also believed in regulation. He saw giant corporations as potential threats to democracy. If companies grew powerful enough to control markets, they could control government too. That couldn't be allowed. In 1906, the federal government filed suit under the Sherman Antitrust Act. United States versus Standard Oil Company of New Jersey sought to dissolve Standard Oil as an illegal monopoly. The case would take 5 years to resolve, but its filing marked a turning point. The government was directly challenging the company John had spent 40 years building. John was 73 years old when the suit was filed. He had recently stepped down from active management of Standard Oil, though he remained the largest shareholder. His health was declining. Stress manifested as digestive problems, insomnia, eventually complete hair loss. The robust young man who could work 18-hour days had become a frail old man who tired easily. But his mind remained sharp. He followed the antitrust case closely, reading transcripts, consulting with lawyers, offering strategic advice. The government's argument was simple. Standard Oil controlled 90% of oil refining in America. This level of dominance couldn't exist without restraint of trade. The monopoly itself was the violation. Standard Oil's defense was equally simple. The company had grown large by being efficient. It hadn't broken any laws. Competitors were free to enter the market. That they rarely succeeded wasn't Standard Oil's responsibility. Size wasn't illegal. Efficiency wasn't illegal. Success wasn't illegal. The trial lasted 2 years. Witnesses described decades of Standard Oil's competitive practices. Former employees testified about internal operations. Economists debated whether monopolies were inherently harmful. The testimony filled thousands of pages. In 1909, the Federal Circuit Court ruled against Standard Oil. The decision was sweeping. The company had indeed violated the Sherman Act. It must be dissolved. Standard Oil appealed to the Supreme Court. John spent the next 2 years waiting. He knew the Supreme Court might uphold the dissolution order. The empire he'd built could be shattered by judicial decree. Everything he'd worked for, the entire system he'd created, might be declared illegal and broken apart. His routine remained unchanged. He still rose early. He still worked at his desk. He still kept meticulous records of his daily schedule and expenditures. But friends noticed a change. The confidence that had always characterized him seemed diminished. For the first time, he appeared uncertain. The Supreme Court delivered its decision on May 15, 1911. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White read the opinion for a unanimous court. Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Act. The monopoly was illegal. The company must be dissolved within 6 months into 34 separate independent companies. It was the most sweeping corporate dissolution in American history. The Standard Oil Trust, that controlled 90% of oil refining, would cease to exist. The subsidiaries would become independent competitors. The system John had spent 40 years perfecting would be deliberately dismantled. Wall Street panicked briefly, then realized something. The dissolution created 34 companies, but John and other major shareholders would own stock in all of them. The companies would still operate independently, but they would all be profitable. Instead of owning one monopoly, shareholders would own 34 companies that together controlled the same markets. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California. Each became a major corporation in its own right. The companies that would eventually become Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, all traced their origins to this forced breakup. The stock prices didn't collapse, they rose. The dissolution removed legal uncertainty. The companies could now operate without threat of further antitrust action. Investors celebrated. John's personal wealth, which had been approximately $300 million when the suit was filed, climbed past $900 million in the years following dissolution. He had been broken up and become richer. The government had won its case and made him wealthier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all John. But wealth wasn't the point anymore. It hadn't been for years. The point had been the system, the perfectly organized, completely efficient mechanism that eliminated waste and chaos. That system was now officially illegal. The government had declared that John's entire approach to business violated American principles of fair competition. He never publicly acknowledged any wrongdoing. In rare interviews during his final years, he maintained that Standard Oil had done nothing wrong. The company had made kerosene affordable. It had employed thousands. It had brought order to a chaotic industry. That this required eliminating competitors and dominating markets was simply the nature of efficient business. Critics saw something different. They saw a man who had pursued efficiency so ruthlessly that he'd destroyed the market mechanisms that were supposed to prevent monopoly, who had used secrecy and manipulation to build power that no private citizen should possess, who had proved that unregulated capitalism naturally led to domination by whoever was most willing to be ruthless. The dissolution of Standard Oil fundamentally changed American business law. The Sherman Act had existed for 20 years without seriously threatening any major corporation. The Standard Oil decision showed that antitrust law had teeth. Companies could be broken up. Monopolies could be dismantled. There were limits to how large and dominant a corporation could become. John lived another 26 years after the dissolution. He devoted himself to philanthropy, giving away most of his fortune in carefully planned donations. He established universities, funded medical research, supported churches and educational institutions. He became almost as famous for his giving as he had been for his getting. But Standard Oil remained his defining achievement. The company he built became the template for modern corporate organization. The holding company structure, the vertical integration, the emphasis on efficiency and standardization. Every major corporation that followed learned from Standard Oil's methods, even as they tried to avoid its fate. The transformation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. The man who'd spent 40 years building an empire spent his final decades trying to give it away. But giving money away turned out to be almost as complicated as making it. John approached philanthropy the same way he'd approached business, with calculation, with strategy, with an eye toward efficiency and lasting impact. He didn't simply hand out cash to whoever asked. He studied, he planned, he built systems. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, became his primary vehicle for organized giving. It wasn't just a charity, it was an institution designed to address fundamental problems through systematic intervention. The Foundation's charter was breathtakingly ambitious: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Not just Americans, not just the poor, or the sick, or the uneducated. Mankind throughout the world. The scale of the thinking was pure Rockefeller. Medical research became one major focus. The foundation funded campaigns against hookworm in the American South, yellow fever in Latin America, and eventually helped establish public health systems across multiple continents. They didn't just treat sick people, they built the infrastructure to prevent disease. Education was another priority. Rockefeller money established the University of Chicago in 1890, turned a struggling Baptist school into one of America's premier research institutions. He funded Spelman College, a historically black women's college in Atlanta. He supported countless smaller schools and libraries. Scientific research received massive support. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, founded in 1901, became one of the world's leading centers for biological and medical science. Scientists working with Rockefeller funding made fundamental discoveries about viruses, bacteria, and human disease. The amounts were staggering. Over his lifetime, John gave away approximately $550 million. In today's money, that's roughly $15 billion. It was systematic generosity on an unprecedented scale, but the giving came with strings attached, always. Rockefeller demanded accountability. Recipients had to prove they were using funds efficiently. They had to demonstrate results. They had to submit to oversight and evaluation. The same obsession with efficiency that had built Standard Oil now governed his philanthropy. Critics saw hypocrisy. How could a man who destroyed competitors and manipulated markets suddenly claim to be serving humanity? The money came from practices that had been declared illegal, from workers who'd been paid minimal wages, from communities whose resources had been extracted and whose businesses had been crushed. Was giving back a fraction of what you'd taken really generosity? The question haunted discussions of Rockefeller philanthropy then and now. Some historians argue that the charitable giving was genuine, motivated by sincere religious conviction and a desire to do good. Others see it as reputation laundering, an attempt to buy respectability and public forgiveness. The truth was probably both, and neither. John genuinely believed he was doing good work. His religious faith, though criticized as hypocritical by enemies, appears to have been real. He attended church regularly throughout his life. He read scripture. He believed wealth was a divine trust that carried obligations, but he also understood public relations. The philanthropy transformed his image from robber baron to benevolent patriarch. The photographs from his later years show a gentle old man handing out dimes to children, not the ruthless businessman who crushed competitors without hesitation. The dimes became famous. Starting around 1913, John began carrying a pocketful of new dimes everywhere he went. He'd hand them out to children, to workers, to anyone he encountered. It became his signature gesture. A dime was worth something in 1913, about $3 in today's money. But the gesture itself was worth more. It was humanizing, accessible. The richest man in America, giving pocket change to ordinary people, created a connection that no amount of institutional philanthropy could match. Cynics called it a publicity stunt. They were right, but that didn't make it meaningless. The children who received those dimes remembered the moment for the rest of their lives. The strange old man with the thin frame and the piercing eyes who'd stopped to speak with them, who'd pressed a shiny coin into their palm and told them to save it. Some kept the dimes forever. They're collector's items now. But the personal giving, the dimes and the handshakes, couldn't erase the Standard Oil legacy. The company John built continued to dominate American energy markets long after its forced breakup. The 34 successor companies remained the largest players in their respective regions. They coordinated informally in ways the law couldn't prevent. They hired each other's executives. They shared technical knowledge. They avoided competing too aggressively with each other. The breakup had created the appearance of competition without the reality. Meanwhile, John's personal life had quieted to almost nothing. His wife Seti died in 1915 after 51 years of marriage. She'd been his anchor, the person who'd kept him connected to something beyond business and efficiency. Her death left him more isolated. He'd never been particularly close to his children. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had taken over management of the family's philanthropic enterprises. The younger John was less ruthless than his father, more concerned with public perception, more willing to engage with critics. He would eventually give away even more than his father had, including the land that became the United Nations headquarters in New York. But the relationship between father and son remained formal, respectful but distant. John's 3 daughters had married well, moved into society circles their father could never fully access despite his wealth. He saw them occasionally, but wasn't particularly involved in their lives. The isolation intensified as he aged. Old business associates died or drifted away. The world he'd dominated was changing rapidly. The automobile was replacing horse-drawn carriages. Electricity was spreading through cities. Radio was beginning to transform communication. Motion pictures were becoming a major entertainment industry. And gasoline, not kerosene, was becoming Standard Oil's most important product. The Model T Ford, introduced in 1908, made automobiles affordable for middle-class Americans. By 1920, there were millions of cars on American roads, all of them running on gasoline refined from petroleum. The product that had seemed like a waste byproduct in the 1860s was now more valuable than the kerosene that had built Standard Oil's fortune. John had lived long enough to see his industry transform completely. The technology that had made him rich was obsolete. The technology that would dominate the 20th century was just emerging. But the companies he'd built were perfectly positioned to exploit it. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which would eventually become Exxon, became the world's largest oil company. Standard Oil of New York, later Mobil, dominated East Coast markets. Standard Oil of California, eventually Chevron, controlled the West. Together with a few other major companies, they shaped global energy markets for decades. The dissolution had barely slowed them down. John spent his final years at his estate in Pocantico Hills, New York. The property covered thousands of acres, carefully landscaped, meticulously maintained. He'd built a mansion there that rivaled anything the European aristocracy could offer. It was a strange ending for someone who'd grown up in a 2-room house in upstate New York. He followed a rigid daily schedule, rose early, ate simple food, took carefully measured exercise, avoided stress. His doctors had warned him for decades that overwork would kill him. He'd outlived most of them. He played golf badly, but enthusiastically. He counted every stroke meticulously, kept detailed records of his rounds, analysed his performance with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to oil refineries. Even recreation was a system to be optimised. Visitors reported that he remained sharp mentally well into his 90s. He read newspapers, he followed business developments, he asked detailed questions about the companies that bore his name, but he made no decisions. That era had ended. The public perception of John D. Rockefeller by the 1920s was complex and contradictory. He was simultaneously admired and reviled, a symbol of American success and American excess, a generous philanthropist and a ruthless monopolist, a deeply religious man and a conscienceless businessman. None of these contradictions bothered him particularly. He'd never cared much about public opinion except as it affected his business operations. The criticism that had wounded him in earlier years rolled off him now. He was too old, too rich, too removed from the daily struggle to care what newspapers said. But he never admitted wrongdoing, never acknowledged that Standard Oil's methods had been unethical, never expressed regret for the competitors destroyed, the workers exploited, the communities damaged. In his mind, he'd simply been efficient, more efficient than anyone else. That efficiency had benefited consumers, through lower prices, had benefited the economy through reliable supply, had benefited society through the wealth that funded his philanthropy. The fact that efficiency had required eliminating competition and dominating markets was simply how business worked. The strong survived, the weak disappeared. That was natural law, not cruelty. This worldview, shaped by social Darwinism and Protestant work ethic, defined an entire generation of American industrialists. But none had taken it as far as John. None had built such a perfect machine. None had demonstrated so completely what unregulated capitalism could become. The Gilded Age that had enabled his rise was ending. Progressive reforms were reshaping American society. Labor unions were gaining power. Government regulation was expanding. The assumption that business should be left alone to pursue efficiency without regard for broader social impact was being challenged. John had lived long enough to see his philosophy become unfashionable. The next generation of wealthy Americans would at least pretend to care about social responsibility. They would talk about stakeholders, not just shareholders. They would acknowledge obligations beyond profit maximization. Whether they meant it was another question, but the naked pursuit of monopoly that had characterized John's career was no longer acceptable. The mask had to stay on. The efficiency had to be justified by something beyond efficiency itself. John turned 97 in 1936. He'd outlived most of his critics and most of his defenders. The Standard Oil monopoly had been broken up 25 years earlier. The progressive era that had produced antitrust law had given way to the Jazz Age and then the Great Depression. The world he'd shaped was barely recognizable, but the system he'd built survived, not in its original form, but in spirit. The emphasis on standardization, on efficiency, on systematic organization of complex operations. These principles had spread far beyond the oil industry. They'd become the foundation of modern corporate management. Every major corporation that followed studied Standard Oil's methods: how to achieve vertical integration, how to control supply chains, how to use holding companies to coordinate operations across multiple entities, how to gather market intelligence, how to pressure competitors, how to manage public perception. They learned the techniques while trying to avoid the fate: stay big, but not too big; stay dominant, but not too dominant; control markets, but leave enough appearance of competition to satisfy regulators. It was Standard Oil's legacy, sanitized and legalized. The machine rebuilt with better camouflage. John never saw it quite that way. In his final years, when reporters occasionally asked about Standard Oil, he maintained the same position he'd always held. The company had done good work. It had served the public. It had been unjustly attacked by politicians and journalists who didn't understand business. He died believing he'd been right. On May 23, 1937, John D. Rockefeller died in his sleep at his home in Ormond Beach, Florida. He was 97 years old. He'd lived longer than any American industrialist, before or since. He'd built the largest fortune in American history. He'd fundamentally shaped American business practices and American society. The obituaries were long and detailed. They recounted his rise from humble origins. They catalogued his business achievements. They described his philanthropic legacy, but they couldn't quite decide whether to admire or condemn him. The papers struggled with the fundamental contradiction. Here was a man who'd given away hundreds of millions of dollars to universities, medical research, and charitable causes. Here was also a man whose business practices had crushed thousands of competitors and extracted maximum profit from millions of customers. How to reconcile these two Johns? Some obituaries emphasized the philanthropist. They noted that his donations had funded breakthroughs in medicine, education, and science. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research had made genuine contributions to human welfare. The University of Chicago had become a world-class institution. Countless smaller beneficiaries had received support. that changed their trajectories. Others focused on the monopolist. They reminded readers that the fortune funding all this generosity had been built through methods that were now illegal, that the wealth distributed so carefully had been accumulated so ruthlessly, that no amount of charity could undo the damage done to competitive markets and democratic governance. Both perspectives were true. Both were incomplete. The funeral was private, held at the Rockefeller estate in Pocantico Hills. Only family and close associates attended. John had never sought public display in death any more than in life. The man who'd been the most photographed businessman in America for decades left the world quietly. His will revealed the final disposition of a fortune that even after decades of giving remained staggering. The bulk went to the Rockefeller Foundation and other charitable entities he'd established. His children received substantial inheritances, though far less than the total he'd given away. Junior, who'd spent 3 decades managing his father's philanthropic empire, inherited control of the family's remaining business interests and the responsibility for continuing the charitable work. The estate was valued at approximately $26 million, a modest sum by the standards of the fortune John had once controlled. The rest had already been distributed during his lifetime, transferred systematically to foundations and trusts that would continue his work after his death. But numbers couldn't capture the full scope of what he'd built. The Rockefeller Foundation would operate for decades, funding research and development across multiple continents. The General Education Board would help transform American education. The Rockefeller Institute would contribute to medical advances that saved millions of lives. The University of Chicago would produce dozens of Nobel Prize winners. These institutions had momentum independent of their founder. They would long outlive the memory of how the money that created them had been made. Junior proved a capable steward of this legacy. He lacked his father's business genius, but he understood public relations in ways John never had. Where his father had been defensive and secretive, Junior was open and engaged. He met with labor leaders. He supported progressive causes. He built Rockefeller Center during the Depression, creating jobs when they were desperately needed. He donated the land for the United Nations headquarters. He became the kind of public figure his father had always refused to be. The Rockefeller name gradually transformed from a symbol of monopoly power into a symbol of enlightened philanthropy. This was partly Junior's achievement, but it was also the work of time and selective memory. New generations knew the foundations and universities. They didn't know the detailed history of how Standard Oil had operated. The rough edges were sanded down. The contradictions were simplified. John became a figure of American mythology, the poor boy who'd built an empire and then given it away. This simplified story served everyone's purposes. It allowed business leaders to point to John as evidence that capitalism could be both profitable and benevolent. It allowed philanthropists to cite him as proof that private giving could address social problems. It allowed Americans to believe that their system, whatever its flaws, produced men who ultimately did more good than harm. But the real John was more complicated than the myth. He'd been genuinely generous with his money and genuinely ruthless in acquiring it. He'd believed sincerely in efficiency and used that belief to justify crushing competition. He'd been personally modest while building a monument to concentrated economic power. He'd lived simply while accumulating wealth beyond the comprehension of ordinary people. The contradiction wasn't hypocrisy exactly. It was something stranger. John had actually believed that building Standard Oil and funding universities were part of the same project. That systematic organization of resources for maximum efficiency was inherently good, whether applied to oil refineries or medical research. That his business practices and his philanthropic practices were expressions of the same fundamental principles. This belief allowed him to sleep soundly despite the thousands of competitors he'd destroyed and the millions of customers he'd overcharged. He wasn't being cruel, he was being efficient. The system required it. Individual hardship was regrettable, but necessary for the greater good of industrial organization. Whether this belief was genuine or a convenient rationalization, we'll never know. Probably it was both. Human beings are capable of extraordinary self-justification. We can believe our own narratives even when they contradict observed reality. John believed he'd served humanity by building Standard Oil. He believed this until the day he died. The question that haunted his critics then, and haunts us now, is whether the ends justified the means, whether the medical research funded by Rockefeller money justified the business practices that created it, whether the universities he built balanced the markets he distorted, whether the good outweighed the harm. There's no objective answer. The calculation depends on values that can't be quantified. How much does efficiency matter compared to fairness? How much does innovation matter compared to competition? How much does philanthropic impact matter compared to the methods used to generate the wealth being distributed? These questions extended far beyond John. They applied to the entire system that had enabled his rise. American capitalism in the late 19th century had produced extraordinary industrial growth and extraordinary inequality. It had generated immense wealth and immense suffering. It had created opportunities for some and crushed opportunities for others. John was both product and architect of this system. He hadn't invented it, but he'd perfected it. He'd shown what was possible when someone pursued efficiency without constraint, when someone organized resources without regard for anything but optimal utilization. The result was Standard Oil, the most successful monopoly in American history, and the reason antitrust law exists. His death marked the end of an era in more ways than one. The last of the great 19th century industrialists was gone. Carnegie had died in 1919, Morgan in 1913, Harriman in 1909, Vanderbilt in 1877. The men who'd built America's industrial infrastructure and accumulated its first great fortunes were now all dead. Their children and grandchildren inherited wealth, but not the same ruthless drive. They'd been raised in comfort, educated at elite schools, socialized into the upper class. They were philanthropists and socialites, not builders and consolidators. They managed fortunes rather than creating them. They were respectable in ways their fathers had never been. This generational shift reflected broader changes in American society. The progressive era had imposed limits on business behavior. The New Deal had expanded government regulation further. Labor unions had gained power. The assumption that markets should be left alone to find their own equilibrium had been replaced by recognition that markets needed rules, boundaries, oversight. Standard Oil's breakup in 1911 had been part of this transformation. But the successor companies thrived. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and the others that emerged from the dissolution became major corporations in their own right. They competed with each other. Sometimes they also cooperated carefully within the bounds of what antitrust law permitted. The monopoly was gone, but oligopoly remained. John's methods had been outlawed, but his principles survived. Vertical integration became standard practice across industries. Systematic organization of complex operations became the foundation of corporate management. The pursuit of efficiency, above all else, remained the defining characteristic of American business. The difference was that later generations learned to disguise what John had done openly. They learned to maintain the appearance of competition while coordinating informally. They learned to dominate markets without creating legal monopolies. They learned to exercise power without attracting the kind of scrutiny that had destroyed Standard Oil. This was perhaps John's most enduring legacy, not the specific company he built, but the model he created, the demonstration that systematic organization and strategic control could generate wealth on a scale previously unimaginable. Every major corporation that followed studied his methods and adapted them to their own circumstances. Tech companies in the 21st century would face accusations similar to those that destroyed Standard Oil, that they'd grown too large, that they dominated their markets too completely, that they used their power to crush competition, that they needed to be broken up for the good of the economy and society. The arguments echoed across the century. The details differed, but the fundamental tension remained the same. How much concentration of economic power should society tolerate? At what point does efficiency become monopoly? When does success become abuse of dominance? John never doubted his answers to these questions. He believed that concentration was natural, that monopoly was efficient, that Standard Oil served the public interest precisely because it dominated its market so completely. Regulation was misguided interference. Breaking up the company was destructive vandalism. The politicians and journalists who attacked him were ignorant or corrupt or both. This certainty was both his strength and his limitation. It allowed him to build something extraordinary. It also blinded him to legitimate concerns about concentrated power. He couldn't understand why people feared what he'd created because he couldn't imagine anyone using such power badly. He would use it well, therefore it was safe. The possibility that someone else might not be so benevolent never seriously occurred to him. His philanthropy reflected the same blind spot. He gave away money on his own terms, according to his own priorities, without meaningful input from the communities he claimed to serve. The Rockefeller Foundation decided what research deserved funding. The General Education Board decided what kind of education should be promoted. John's vision of the good shaped everything his money touched. This wasn't unusual for the era. All the great philanthropists operated this way. But it revealed an assumption about who should make decisions that affected millions of lives. Not democratic institutions, not the people actually experiencing the problems, but wealthy individuals who'd proven their superiority by accumulating fortunes. The assumption was that business success demonstrated a kind of wisdom that qualified someone to reshape society, that the same abilities that built Standard Oil could improve education, advance medicine, and solve social problems, that efficiency and organization were universal virtues applicable to any domain. Sometimes this assumption proved correct. The Rockefeller Foundation did fund important medical research. The University of Chicago did become an excellent institution, but sometimes it failed spectacularly, imposing solutions that didn't fit local contexts or privileging certain approaches while suppressing alternatives. The deeper problem was the concentration of decision-making power itself. Whether John's choices were wise or foolish, the fact that he alone made them was troubling. Democracy means distributing power. Plutocracy means concentrating it. John's philanthropy was fundamentally plutocratic, an exercise of private power over public goods. He never saw it that way. He saw himself as a steward of resources that he'd earned through superior ability and that he was now deploying for maximum benefit. The fact that he got to define what constituted maximum benefit seemed natural to him. Who else was qualified to make such decisions? This question outlived him. As wealth inequality has grown over the past several decades, philanthropic power has grown with it. Modern billionaires fund charter schools, medical research, climate initiatives, and countless other causes. Like John, they operate largely according to their own vision of what society needs. Like John, they face criticism that private wealth shouldn't determine public priorities. The arguments haven't changed much in a century, neither have the stakes. The final decades of John D. Rockefeller's life played out in a peculiar isolation. He'd retired from active business management in 1897, stepping back from Standard Oil's day-to-day operations while retaining his massive ownership stake. He was still the richest man in the world, but increasingly he was a figure from another era, watching as the world he'd helped create moved beyond him. He settled into a routine as rigid as the one he'd maintained during his working years. Winters at his estate in Ormond Beach, Florida, summers at Forest Hill in Cleveland or Kikuit, his grand estate overlooking the Hudson River, golf every morning, business correspondence in the afternoon, family dinners, early to bed. The man who'd revolutionized an industry spent his final years in careful, controlled repetition. His body aged but refused to quit entirely. He'd always been thin, almost frail-looking despite his iron constitution. Now he became gaunt. His hair, which he'd started losing in his 50s due to alopecia, never grew back. He wore wigs in public. His digestion, always sensitive, became more troublesome. He followed strict diets prescribed by his doctors, eating plain foods in small portions at regular intervals. Yet he persisted. Into his 80s, then his 90s. The actuarial tables said he should have been dead. He kept going. Friends died. Business associates died. His son John Jr., whom he'd groomed to manage the family fortune and philanthropic enterprises, grew middle-aged while waiting for full control. The world outside his estates was transforming in ways that must have seemed incomprehensible to someone born before the Civil War. Automobiles replaced horse-drawn carriages. The Wright brothers flew. Radio arrived. The First World War erupted, killing millions in a mechanized horror that would have been unimaginable in 1870. Women gained the vote. Jazz filled the air. Everything was faster, louder, more chaotic. John watched it all from a remove. He read newspapers. He received reports. He knew what was happening, but he experienced it as information, not as lived reality. The last time he truly engaged with the world beyond his control had been during the antitrust battles. After the Supreme Court decision, he retreated into the careful management of his wealth and reputation. Standard Oil had been broken into 34 separate companies in 1911. The government's case argued that this would restore competition and lower prices for consumers. Instead, something unexpected happened. The separate companies, no longer bound together, but still dominating their respective markets, became even more valuable. The sum of the parts exceeded the whole. John's wealth actually increased after the breakup. He owned significant stakes in nearly all the successor companies. As they competed and innovated separately, stock prices rose. The trust busting that was supposed to diminish his fortune instead multiplied it. By 1913, he was worth nearly $1 billion in an era when that represented an almost incomprehensible concentration of wealth. He never gloated about this publicly. That wouldn't have fit his carefully cultivated image of dignified philanthropy. But privately, it must have confirmed his belief that breaking up Standard Oil had been unnecessary. The market had functioned, prices hadn't skyrocketed, the companies had prospered. See, he'd been right all along. This vindication came too late to restore his reputation among the general public. The Ludlow Massacre had seen to that. In 1914, Colorado National Guardsmen and Company Guards had attacked a tent colony of striking coal miners and their families. The camp caught fire. 2 women and 11 children died, suffocated in a pit they dug beneath their tent to hide from the gunfire. The mine was owned by Colorado Fuel and Iron, which the Rockefeller family controlled. John hadn't ordered the attack. He didn't know it was coming. He was in New York, removed from the daily operations of a company he owned, but didn't manage. But that didn't matter. The public blamed him. Labour activists called it the Ludlow Massacre and made it a symbol of capitalist brutality. Mothers and children killed by men paid with Rockefeller money to protect Rockefeller property. The crisis forced John Jr. to engage with labour issues more seriously. He hired public relations experts. He visited the Colorado mines personally, something his father never would have done. He began developing what would eventually become more progressive labor policies, but the damage to the family name was immense. John Sr. responded by giving away money faster. If the public saw him as a villain, he would prove them wrong through generosity. The Rockefeller Foundation's budget increased. New initiatives launched. More medical research funded. More educational institutions supported. More social problems addressed with Rockefeller dollars. He was trying to buy redemption, though he would never have phrased it that way. He believed he was doing good work that happened to also improve his legacy. The two goals were inseparable in his mind. Doing good meant being recognized for doing good. Otherwise, what was the point? His grandchildren grew up in this strange environment, surrounded by enormous wealth and equally enormous expectations. They were Rockefellers, which meant something very specific. It meant responsibility. It meant service. It meant never forgetting that their privilege came with obligations. John Jr. drilled this into them relentlessly, having internalized his own father's lessons about stewardship and duty. The grandchildren would scatter across various endeavors. Nelson became a politician, serving as governor of New York and vice president. Winthrop also became a governor in Arkansas. David ran Chase Manhattan Bank. Lawrence invested in aerospace and conservation. John III focused on Asia and population issues. Abby Rockefeller Mose supported the arts. They embodied different versions of what it meant to be wealthy and responsible. But that was later. During John Sr.'s final years, they were children and teenagers, occasionally brought to visit the old man at his estates. He would distribute dimes to them, just as he'd distributed dimes to strangers for decades. It was his signature gesture, a tiny coin from the world's richest man, meant to teach something about thrift and gratitude and the value of small things. What did they think of him? Their aged grandfather, sitting in his wheelchair or moving slowly through the gardens. This figure who loomed so large in public imagination but seemed diminished in person. The historical record doesn't capture those private impressions well. They were respectful, they were dutiful, but they were growing up in a different world, one where the certainties of their grandfather's era no longer held. The 1920s arrived. Prohibition banned alcohol. The stock market soared. Fortunes were made overnight by people who didn't build anything, who simply traded pieces of paper back and forth in an increasingly frenzied speculation. John watched this with concern. He'd always believed that wealth should be earned through productive enterprise, through building something real. This casino capitalism disturbed him. He was right to be disturbed. The crash came in 1929, wiping out millions of investors and triggering the Great Depression. John didn't suffer. His fortune was too well diversified, too carefully managed. But the crash confirmed something he'd always believed about the dangers of speculation divorced from real value. His world kept shrinking. Fewer visitors, fewer activities, more time alone with his thoughts and his newspapers, and his carefully managed routines. He was approaching 100 years old, an almost unthinkable lifespan for someone born in 1839. He'd lived long enough to see the world he'd known disappear almost completely. The boy who'd grown up in modest circumstances in upstate New York, whose father was an itinerant salesman of dubious character, whose mother had struggled to keep the family together, had become the richest man in the world. He'd built an empire. He'd changed how business operated. He'd become a symbol, for better and worse, of American capitalism itself. And now he was simply old. The empire remained, transformed and dispersed, but still massive. The wealth remained, carefully stewarded and increasingly directed toward charitable purposes. The name remained, carrying weight and meaning and complicated associations, but the man himself was fading, his body finally surrendering to time after holding out far longer than anyone expected. He celebrated his 97th birthday in July 1936. There was cake. There were dimes distributed to staff and well-wishers. There were photographs for the newspapers, showing the ancient titan smiling his careful smile, surrounded by family. He looked impossibly old, impossibly thin, but still present, still aware. 2 months later, on the morning of May 23rd, 1937, John D. Rockefeller died in his sleep at his home in Ormond Beach. He was 97 years old. His heart simply stopped. After nearly a century of beating, it decided enough was enough. The obituaries were massive. Newspapers across the country devoted pages to his life and legacy. Some praised him as a great industrialist and philanthropist. Some condemned him as a ruthless monopolist whose charitable giving couldn't erase his business practices. Most tried to grapple with both realities simultaneously, acknowledging that he'd been complicated, that simple hero or villain narratives couldn't capture someone who'd operated at such scale. His estate was valued at around $26 million. This seems modest for the world's richest man, but it reflected decades of giving away his fortune. He'd transferred vast sums to his son and to his various philanthropic foundations. The money he'd accumulated through Standard Oil had been systematically redistributed, though always according to his own vision of how it should be used. The funeral was private, attended by family and close associates. He was buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, not far from where he'd started his career, as a young bookkeeper. The grave was marked with a simple stone bearing his name and dates. No grand monument, no elaborate tomb, just a marker indicating that here lay a man who'd lived and died. The world moved on. The Standard Oil successor companies continued operating, many of them growing into giants in their own right. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, all traced their lineage back to the trust John built. The Rockefeller Foundation continued its work, funding research and initiatives around the world. The family remained prominent, though gradually the name became less associated with oil and more with philanthropy and public service. John's vision of capitalism, the belief that concentration and efficiency were inherently good, fell out of favour. The New Deal brought aggressive government intervention in the economy. Antitrust enforcement strengthened. The idea that business leaders should be left alone to do what they thought best was replaced by the idea that democratic oversight was necessary to prevent abuse of power. John would have disagreed strenuously, yet aspects of his approach persisted. The emphasis on efficiency and systematic organization became standard in American business. The model of large corporations dominating their industries remained common, even if outright monopolies were prevented. And his approach to philanthropy, the idea of applying business principles to social problems, became the template for modern foundation work. He'd wanted to be remembered as a builder and a benefactor. Instead, he became a symbol of an entire era, representing both the extraordinary productive capacity of industrial capitalism and its tendency toward concentration and abuse. Robber baron and philanthropist, monopolist and medical research benefactor, the man who gave dimes to children and crushed competitors without mercy. These contradictions never resolved in his lifetime. They haven't resolved since. We're still arguing about whether his business practices were justified by their results. We're still debating whether his philanthropy redeemed his reputation. We're still grappling with questions about wealth, power, and responsibility that his career brought into sharp focus. What would John think of our current moment? Of the tech billionaires and hedge fund managers who've accumulated fortunes that rival his in purchasing power? Of the ongoing debates about monopoly and market power? Of the continued tension between efficiency and competition, between private initiative and public oversight? He'd probably see much that was familiar. The patterns repeat. Innovators create new technologies or business models. They scale rapidly. They dominate their markets. Critics cry monopoly. Defenders point to consumer benefits. Regulators intervene or don't. Wealth concentrates. philanthropic foundations launch, the arguments continue. The specifics change, but the fundamental tensions remain. How much concentration is too much? When does success become abuse? Who decides how private wealth serves public purposes? These questions outlasted John D. Rockefeller. They'll outlast us too. The Cleveland mansion where John died was sold, demolished, then replaced by other buildings. The estate at Pocantico Hills remained in family hands for generations, eventually donated to the state of New York as a historic site. Visitors walk the grounds today, admiring the views John once enjoyed, perhaps wondering what it felt like to possess such wealth, such power, such control over an entire industry. But understanding John D. Rockefeller requires looking beyond the mansion and the money. It requires grappling with a fundamental question about how economies should work and who should control them. John believed deeply in what he called cooperation. He used the word constantly in his autobiography and public statements. Cooperation meant eliminating what he saw as wasteful competition. It meant bringing order to chaos. It meant rational planning replacing market disorder. Standard Oil, in his view, was the perfection of this principle. One organization, one vision, maximum efficiency. Critics called this monopoly. John called it progress. The distinction matters because it reveals two entirely different ways of thinking about economic organization. One view holds that competition, however messy and wasteful it might appear, serves essential functions. It disciplines producers. It drives innovation. It prevents any single entity from gaining too much control. Another view holds that competition is primitive and destructive, that rational planning by capable managers produces better outcomes for everyone. John was firmly in the second camp. He looked at the chaotic oil industry of the 1860s and 1870s, with its boom and bust cycles, its price volatility, its redundant infrastructure, and saw waste. He built a system that eliminated that waste. Production was rationalized, distribution was optimized, prices stabilized, consumers got reliable products at lower cost than they'd paid before. This wasn't entirely self-serving propaganda. Standard Oil genuinely did make kerosene cheaper and more widely available. The company's efficiency gains were real. The technical improvements were substantial. If the only measure of success is delivering product to consumers at low cost, Standard Oil succeeded brilliantly. But that's not the only measure. There's also the question of power and its potential for abuse. There's the issue of what happens when one entity controls so much that everyone else must deal with it on its terms. There's the problem of what economists would later call barriers to entry, the ways that dominant firms can prevent competition from emerging even when they're not technically breaking any laws. John never fully grasped why people found this troubling. He genuinely believed that if Standard Oil served consumers well, if it operated efficiently, if it didn't engage in crude price gouging, then what did it matter that the company dominated its industry? He'd earned that dominance through superior performance. Protecting inefficient competitors made no sense to him. This blind spot was characteristic. John understood business systems brilliantly. He understood markets poorly. He could see how to organize a company, but struggled to understand why people valued competitive markets, even when they produced less tidy outcomes. He knew how to accumulate power, but couldn't quite grasp why others feared concentrated power, even when wielded by someone who considered himself benevolent. The legacy extends beyond oil. Standard Oil's organizational innovations influenced corporate America for generations. The multi-divisional structure, the emphasis on systematic cost accounting, the use of statistical analysis to drive decisions, these became standard practice. Business schools taught case studies based on Standard Oil's methods. Managers studied how John had built his empire, but so did regulators. The progressive era reforms that followed the Standard Oil breakup established principles that still govern antitrust enforcement today. The idea that market dominance itself can be problematic, regardless of whether a company is technically breaking specific rules. The notion that certain business practices, while perhaps not illegal in themselves, become concerning when employed by firms with overwhelming market power. The principle that competition has value beyond pure efficiency. These ideas were tested against Standard Oil and refined through that experience. Modern antitrust law is in many ways a response to John D. Rockefeller, an attempt to prevent the emergence of future Standard Oils, while still allowing businesses to grow and succeed. Has it worked? The question remains contested. Some argue that antitrust enforcement has been too weak, allowing tech platforms and other modern monopolies to accumulate power rivaling Standard Oil's. Others contend that enforcement has been too aggressive, preventing beneficial mergers and punishing success. The arguments echo the debates of John's era with updated examples. What's clear is that the fundamental tension John's career exemplified never disappeared. Capitalism generates concentration. Successful companies grow. They achieve economies of scale. They develop competitive advantages. Left unchecked, this process tends toward monopoly, but checking it requires intervention that many see as interfering with property rights and market processes. John thought the solution was obvious. Let capable people build efficient organizations. Trust that their self-interest in maintaining their businesses would prevent abuse. Assume that if a monopoly truly misbehaved, competitors would emerge to discipline it. Government should protect property rights and enforce contracts, but otherwise stay out of the way. History suggested this faith was misplaced. Standard Oil's competitors didn't emerge naturally. They were suppressed through practices that, while sometimes legal, prevented market forces from working. When the company was finally broken up, the successor firms competed vigorously, suggesting that the market could indeed function if given the chance. Consumer welfare didn't collapse when Standard Oil lost its monopoly. The industry adapted and continued serving its purpose. John never accepted this verdict. He died believing that the breakup had been a mistake, that it had destroyed something valuable, that the government had interfered with a system that was working well. His autobiography, written decades after the dissolution, still expresses bewilderment that anyone could have seen Standard Oil as harmful. This conviction reflects something important about how people see their own actions. John couldn't separate his personal success from broader principles. Because he'd succeeded through efficiency and organization, he assumed these qualities justified any level of market dominance. Because he saw himself as honest and principled, he assumed the power he wielded was safe. Because his intentions were to serve customers and generate wealth, he couldn't understand why others found his methods threatening. The pattern appears throughout history. Powerful people, having achieved success through certain methods, become convinced those methods are inherently right. They see criticism as motivated by jealousy or misunderstanding. They interpret resistance as proof that others are too foolish to recognize what's good for them. John exemplified this tendency. He was brilliant, hard-working, and honest by his own lights. Therefore, he reasoned, the system he built must be good. But systems don't stay good just because their builders are talented. Power doesn't remain benign just because it's initially wielded carefully. The question isn't whether John D. Rockefeller was a good man or a bad man. It's whether any individual or organization should hold the kind of control he achieved, regardless of how they might use it. That question remains urgent. We live in an era of extraordinary corporate concentration. A handful of companies dominate search, social media, e-commerce, smartphone operating systems. They achieved this dominance through innovation and efficiency, much as Standard Oil did. They provide services that billions of people use daily. They argue, much as John did, that their success proves they're serving consumers well, yet critics worry. They point to the power these platforms have over speech and commerce. They note how difficult it is for competitors to challenge them. They observe that efficiency and consumer benefit don't address all concerns about concentrated power. They argue that some entities have become too big, too dominant, too central to too many aspects of economic and social life. The debate continues with new examples but familiar themes: innovation versus control, efficiency versus competition, private initiative versus public oversight. The same tensions John's career brought into focus, playing out again with different technologies and different personalities, but the same underlying questions. What would John make of this? He'd probably see vindication in the continued success of large corporations. He'd point out that the tech giants became dominant through superior products, just as Standard Oil had. He'd argue that breaking them up would sacrifice efficiency for no good reason. He'd insist that competition will emerge naturally if these companies truly misbehave. But he'd be missing the point, just as he missed it in his own time. The question isn't whether dominant firms provide good service today. It's whether the concentration of power they represent is compatible with the kind of economy and society we want. It's whether innovation and efficiency justify any level of control. It's whether we trust market forces alone to discipline dominant players, or whether democratic institutions need to establish boundaries. These aren't questions with obvious answers. Reasonable people disagree, just as they disagreed about Standard Oil. Some emphasize the benefits of scale and integration. Others prioritize competition and distributed power. Some trust business leaders to self-regulate. Others believe oversight is essential. The arguments continue because the underlying tensions are genuine and unresolvable through pure logic. John D. Rockefeller's life and career crystallized these tensions in ways that remain relevant. His success demonstrated what concentrated economic power can achieve. His methods illustrated how that power can be accumulated and maintained. His philanthropy showed how private wealth might serve public purposes. His resistance to regulation revealed the limits of voluntary restraint. The contradictions never resolved. The monopolist who lowered prices, the ruthless competitor who saw himself as cooperative, the religious man who crushed rivals without mercy, the advocate for efficiency who suppressed competition, the philanthropist whose fortune came from practices many found objectionable. These tensions didn't exist despite John's character. They existed because of it, because the same qualities that made him successful in business created problems in the broader economy. We inherit those contradictions. We benefit from the organizational innovations that Standard Oil pioneered while living under antitrust laws designed to prevent another Standard Oil from emerging. We admire entrepreneurial success while worrying about excessive concentration. We want efficient companies while valuing competitive markets. We celebrate wealth creation while questioning how that wealth is generated and used. John wouldn't have understood our ambivalence. He saw clearly and thought others should see clearly too. Business success proved business virtue. Efficiency justified dominance. Wealth earned through legal means was wealth legitimately held. Opposition came from those who couldn't compete or didn't understand. But clarity isn't always wisdom. Sometimes the messy, contradictory middle position comes closer to truth than the confident extremes. Sometimes we need to accept that efficiency and competition both matter, that success doesn't prove righteousness, that power requires constraints even when wielded by talented people. The man who gave away dimes and built a monopoly, the Baptist who crushed competitors on Sundays, the philanthropist whose fortune came from practices that inspired antitrust law, the efficiency expert who suppressed the competition that drives efficiency. John D. Rockefeller contained all these contradictions and never resolved them because he never saw them as contradictions at all. His shadow stretches across American capitalism still, Every debate about market concentration references the Standard Oil case. Every discussion of business ethics considers the gap between legal and right. Every conversation about philanthropy confronts questions about whether private charity can substitute for systemic change. Every argument about regulation returns to the fundamental question of whether markets self-correct or require oversight. John thought he knew the answers. He was wrong about some things and right about others. The ambiguity is appropriate. He was neither the hero his admirers claimed, nor the villain his critics painted. He was a brilliant, limited man who built something extraordinary and terrible at once, whose methods we still study and whose example we still debate. That debate is his truest legacy, not the companies that bear Standard Oil's lineage, not the foundations that spend his money, not even the business practices that became standard. The real legacy is the unresolved question his career posed. How much power is too much? Who decides? What principles should govern the relationship between private success and public welfare? We're still working on the answers. John D. Rockefeller made sure we'd never stop asking the questions, and so we arrive at the end of this story, though the questions it raises refuse to end. John D. Rockefeller died believing he'd been vindicated. The companies that emerged from Standard Oil's breakup thrived. His wealth multiplied even after dissolution. His philanthropy transformed medicine, education, and scientific research. In his mind, this proved he'd been right all along. The system worked. The critics were wrong. History would judge him kindly. History judged him complicated. We remember him now as both things simultaneously. The man who made kerosene affordable for millions, and the man who crushed every competitor who stood in his way. The philanthropist who funded groundbreaking medical research, and the monopolist whose business practices became the reason antitrust law exists. The devoted Baptist who attended church every Sunday, and the ruthless businessman who showed no mercy to rivals. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. They coexist. They're inseparable from each other. You can't understand the philanthropy without understanding where the money came from. You can't evaluate the business practices without acknowledging their efficiency. You can't celebrate the achievements without confronting the methods. The Rockefeller fortune is mostly gone now, given away over 4 generations to universities, medical research, social causes, and public institutions. The foundations continue their work. The name still carries weight. But the oil empire that created it all has transformed beyond recognition. The companies exist, but they're no longer controlled by the family. They're publicly traded corporations, answering to shareholders, operating in markets that John would barely recognize, yet his influence persists in less obvious ways. Every time regulators examine whether a company has grown too dominant, they're applying principles that emerged from the Standard Oil case. Every time a business school teaches vertical integration, they're building on methods John pioneered. Every time a philanthropist creates a foundation to address social problems systematically, they're following a model he established. And every time we debate the relationship between wealth and power, between private initiative and public welfare, between efficiency and competition, we're having arguments that John's career made necessary. He thought he'd solved the problem. He thought cooperation was obviously better than competition. That organization was obviously superior to chaos. That efficiency justified dominance. He couldn't understand why others didn't see what seemed so clear to him. But maybe the problem was never meant to be solved. Maybe the tension between these competing values is permanent. Maybe we're supposed to keep arguing about where the boundaries should be, keep adjusting the balance, keep questioning whether we've got it right. John wanted certainty. He built systems because systems provided answers. He accumulated wealth because wealth could be measured. He gave money away according to clear principles because ambiguity made him uncomfortable. He lived his entire life seeking the perfect balance sheet where everything added up and nothing was left unresolved. He never found it, neither will we. The boy from Richford who kept his first ledger at 14 and the man who controlled 90% of America's oil are the same person, separated by 60 years but connected by the same fundamental belief. That work mattered. That systems mattered. That if you were efficient enough, disciplined enough, organized enough, you could bend the world to order. He was right about that. He did bend the world. We're still living in the world he helped create. Still grappling with the questions his success forced us to ask. Still trying to figure out what his life means and what lessons we should draw from it. Maybe that's the point. Not to reach a final verdict, but to keep examining. Not to decide whether he was hero or villain, but to understand that most people who shape history are neither. They're humans operating at scale, whose choices echo forward in ways they never fully controlled or understood. John D. Rockefeller wanted to be remembered as a builder. He got his wish. We remember the empire he constructed. We remember the fortune he accumulated. We remember the institutions his money created. We remember the monopoly that bore his name. But we also remember the competitors destroyed, the markets distorted, the power concentrated, the trust that had to be broken apart by government decree because it had grown beyond what any private entity should control. Both memories are true. Both matter. Neither tells the complete story alone. That's what makes him fascinating. That's why we're still talking about him nearly a century after his death. Not because we figured him out, but because we haven't. Not because his story resolved cleanly, but because it didn't. He died in his sleep at 97, surrounded by wealth, remembered by millions, secure in his belief that he'd served humanity well. Whether he was right about that depends on what you value, what you think matters more, what kind of world you want to live in. Those are questions each generation has to answer for itself. John gave us his answers through the life he lived and the empire he built. We're still working on ours.